Carter Cervantes. November 28, 2014, 4 in the morning, Fort Worth, Texas. A young woman drives home from an overnight shift, parks her car, walks up the stairs to her apartment. She is tired, she is probably thinking about sleep. She has no idea that someone who once stood beside her at work, someone she had known, spoken to, shared a building with, has already decided that she will not see the end of that day. This is not the story of a stranger. That is what makes it so hard to sit with. Ashlea Ann Harris was 31 years old and the kind of woman people genuinely liked. She worked as an assistant manager at the American Eagle Outfitters store inside the Hewlin Mall in Fort Worth, and by all accounts she carried herself with integrity. She showed up, she was loyal, and when something at work looked wrong, she said so. On Thanksgiving night of 2014, she had stayed late helping the store prepare for the Black Friday rush. It was past 4 in the morning when she finally left. She made it home. She just never made it out again. Carter Cervantes had also worked at that same American Eagle location, also as an assistant manager, and also with a history that trailed her. Before Fort Worth, she had been stationed at the company's Amarillo store, where she began a romantic relationship with a 19-year-old employee named Clarence David Mallory. That was a direct violation of company policy, given that she oversaw his schedule and controlled his pay. When management discovered it, Cervantes was given a choice: resign or transfer. She transferred. Mallory stayed behind in Amarillo, where his performance deteriorated until he was let go and placed on the company's do not hire list. He later moved to Fort Worth to be with Cervantes, who allegedly used falsified information to get him hired at her new store. That job did not last long either. In August of 2014, nearly $18,000 went missing from the store safe. Ashlea Harris had been watching closely, and she pointed to Cervantes and Mallory as the most probable source of the loss. Both were let go. In any ordinary story, that is where this ends. Two people lose their jobs, carry their bitterness somewhere else, and life moves on. But Carter Cervantes was not interested in moving on. She was interested in what came next. The planning was not impulsive, and that is the detail that stays with you. Text messages recovered from both phones showed Cervantes and Mallory mapping out their intentions with a kind of cold efficiency, the way you might organize a move to a new city or plan a road trip. Their thinking was transactional. Killing Ashlea Harris would give them access to her store keys, which in turn would give them access to the store safe, where tens of thousands of dollars in post-Black Friday cash were being held. Rage and greed, fused together, made practical. In the early morning hours of November 28th, while Ashlea had barely set her things down after her overnight shift, the pair entered her apartment. A neighbor 1 floor below heard a thump, then screaming, then an unsettling stillness, followed by the sound of his carbon monoxide alarm and water beginning to seep through his ceiling. The fire sprinklers above had activated. When firefighters arrived, Ashlea's apartment was burning. Her body was found inside. She was bound. Her throat had been cut. She was 31 years old, and she had been home for less than an hour. Police did not need long. A neighbor described a black 2-door Infiniti he had seen parked near Ashlea's vehicle before the fire, and it traced directly to Cervantes. When detectives brought the couple in for questioning, Cervantes sat calmly, offered a story about spending Thanksgiving watching films, and at one point wiped her fingerprints from a water bottle during the interview itself, mid-sentence, with the detectives watching. She did not appear nervous. She appeared practiced. By then, the search warrants had already been signed. Inside Cervantes's car, investigators found a second ski mask, a 9mm handgun, a lock-picking guide, a walkie-talkie, duct tape receipts, and, on the floor mat, Ashlea Harris's blood. The texts did the rest. Investigators also found a site north of Abilene that had been scouted as a burial location, a grave that went unused, suggesting the fire was not the original plan, but an improvisation when things inside the apartment did not go the way they had been scripted. Arrest warrants were issued on December 4th. Mallory was apprehended in Amarillo the following day. Cervantes was taken into custody by Tarrant County deputies on December 6, 2014. Their cases were tried separately. In May 2016, Carter Carroll Cervantes was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Clarence Mallory received the same sentence in August 2017. The lead investigator on the case was clear-eyed about how the roles divided. Cervantes designed it, Mallory carried it out. She is housed today at the Dr. Lane Murray unit in Gatesville, Texas. She will not be leaving. Her case has since been examined across multiple true crime programs, drawing attention less for its shock value than for what it quietly exposes, that the most devastating betrayals do not always come from strangers in the dark. They come from people who once knew your schedule, shared your building, and smiled at you across a break room. Ashley Harris had simply told the truth about missing money. In Carter Cervantes's world, that was a debt that needed settling. Some people lose a job and start over. Others start planning. That difference, invisible from the outside, is the most frightening thing about this case, and about every case like it. Yolanda Saldivar. She never held a weapon before that morning. She was a registered nurse, a woman trained to heal, to stabilize, to save. And yet, on the morning of March 31st, 1995, she walked into a motel room with a loaded revolver and made a decision that would fracture a culture, silence a voice the world was just beginning to fully hear, and earn her a place in history she will never escape. This is the story of Yolanda Saldivar, a woman who was handed everything she ever wanted by the very person she would ultimately destroy. Yolanda Saldivar was born on September 19, 1960 in San Antonio, Texas, the youngest of 7 children. Growing up, she was frequently teased at school, and by most accounts, she was someone who struggled to find belonging. She eventually channeled that quiet hunger for purpose into a nursing career, becoming a registered nurse, a profession built on care, patience, and trust. On the surface, she appeared to be someone doing exactly what she was meant to do. But beneath that surface, there was something else entirely, an almost obsessive need to attach herself to something larger than her own life. That something arrived in the form of Selena Quintanilla Perez. In the mid-1980s, Yolanda Saldivar became a fan of Tejano music, and Selena, the young, magnetic daughter of Abraham Quintanilla, had already begun to take that world by storm. By the time Saldivar attended one of Selena's concerts in San Antonio in 1991, Selena was not just a rising star, she was a phenomenon. Something shifted in Saldivar that night. She began calling Abraham Quintanilla repeatedly, lobbying relentlessly to be allowed to start an official Selena fan club. Abraham eventually gave her permission, and just like that, Yolanda Saldivar had found her purpose. What followed was nothing short of remarkable, at least from the outside. The fan club grew from a few hundred members to over 5,000 in just a few years, becoming one of the largest in the entire San Antonio area. Saldivar threw herself into the work completely. She was dependable, devoted, and always present. Selena reportedly called her mother. Abraham Quintanilla trusted her enough to hand her the keys to Selena's fashion boutiques, known as Selena Etc., making Saldivar the manager. For a woman who had spent much of her life searching for a place to belong, this felt like a rival. But it was a position she was quietly undermining from the very beginning. By early 1995, the Quintanilla family began to notice financial irregularities across both the fan club and the boutique operations. The evidence pointed directly at Saldivar. She had been redirecting funds, issuing unauthorized checks, and steadily draining money from the organizations that Selena had built. When Abraham Quintanilla confronted the situation and moved to cut Saldivar off, she was fired during the first week of March. In a matter of days, everything she had spent years constructing, her identity, her access, her sense of worth, had been stripped away. And here is where the story turns, because what Yolanda Saldivar did next was not the act of someone panicking or reacting without thought. Prosecutors later established that she had purchased the .38 special revolver roughly 3 weeks before that final, devastating morning. 3 weeks! She had time to stop, time to walk away, time to choose differently. She did not. On the morning of March 31st, 1995, Selena agreed to meet Saldivar at a Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi, Texas, room 158, to retrieve financial documents Saldivar had been withholding. Selena walked into that room as a 23-year-old woman on the brink of crossing into mainstream American stardom. She had just won a Grammy Award for Best Mexican-American Album the previous year. She was days away from her 24th birthday. She had an entire future ahead of her. What happened inside that room has been debated ever since. Saldivar would later claim the gun went off accidentally as Selena attempted to leave, but the physical evidence told a different story. Selena was struck by a hollow-point bullet in the back of her right shoulder as she tried to flee. She ran 390 feet through the motel corridor, bleeding, before collapsing in the lobby. Her final words were a plea and an identification. She told the front desk staff to lock the door, then said the name of her attacker and the room number. She held in her hand the diamond ring Saldivar had once given her as a gift. Selena Quintanilla Perez was pronounced dead at 1:05 in the afternoon at Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital. She was 23 years old. That evening, as the world began to process the magnitude of what had happened, Yolanda Saldivar sat in her pickup truck in the motel parking lot, surrounded by police. The standoff lasted more than 9 hours. During those hours, she wept, she bargained, and she pressed the revolver to her own head. She told negotiators she had bought the gun to end her own life. She insisted it had all been an accident. She was taken into custody without further incident. More than 50,000 people lined up to view Selena's body in the days that followed. The outpouring of grief was global. The trial, moved to Houston to allow for an impartial jury, became one of the most closely watched cases in the United States that year, its intensity compared in the press to the O.J. Simpson proceedings. The defense argued that the shooting was unintentional. The prosecution pointed to something that no argument could easily dismiss. Yolanda Saldivar, a trained medical professional who had spent years in healthcare, did not call for emergency help after Selena was shot. She did not check her pulse, she did not apply pressure to the wound. She did nothing. A nurse who knew exactly what to do chose not to do it. On October 23, 1995, a jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. 3 days later, Yolanda Saldivar was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She arrived at the Gatesville unit in Texas on November 22, 1995. In 2025, her parole eligibility finally arrived. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied her release on March 27, 2025, citing a continuing threat to public safety. She remains imprisoned at the Patrick L. O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, Texas, with her next parole review set for March 2030. In a 2024 documentary, Saldivar broke her silence once more, denying the embezzlement, offering new theories, claiming she had been covering for Selena all along. The world listened, and largely did not believe her. Selena was 23. She was 6 days away from her birthday. She had a Grammy. She had the world. And the woman she called mother took all of it away in a motel room on a cloudy March morning with a gun she had purchased 3 weeks before she ever walked through that door. Luigi Mangione. A ghost gun. A red notebook filled with months of private writing. 3 words etched onto the ammunition: delay, deny, depose. On the morning of December 4, 2024, a masked figure waited on a Midtown Manhattan sidewalk in the pre-dawn cold, and in under 30 seconds, the chief executive officer of the largest health insurance company in the United States was gone. What followed was not just a murder investigation. It became a mirror held up to an entire nation, and a lot of people did not look away. Brian Robert Thompson was 50 years old. He had led United Healthcare, the insurance arm of United Health Group, since April of 2021. On that Wednesday morning, he was walking alone from his hotel toward the New York Hilton Midtown, where the company was holding its annual investor conference. He never made it inside. Surveillance cameras captured a masked gunman approaching from behind, drawing a firearm and opening fire. Thompson was struck in the back and in the leg. He collapsed on the pavement. Emergency services arrived, but Thompson was pronounced dead at the scene. He was a father of 2 children. He had lived in Minnesota. He had no idea, as he stepped out onto that sidewalk, that someone had been planning this moment for months. For 5 days, no one knew who had done it. Police released surveillance images of a suspect, tall, masked, wearing a cream-colored hooded jacket and carrying a gray backpack, described by investigators as someone who was, notably, extremely aware of cameras. Tips came in from across the country. The FBI joined the investigation and raised the reward for information to $50,000. Social media, meanwhile, was doing something that investigators likely did not anticipate. A significant segment of the public was not mourning the victim. They were trying to figure out who the shooter was for an entirely different reason. The contempt that millions of Americans felt toward the health insurance industry, the denials, the appeals, the bureaucratic machinery that stood between people and their medical care, had found a sudden, violent face. And some people were looking at that face with something closer to recognition than horror. The arrest came on December 9, 2024, in a city far removed from Manhattan. Luigi Nicholas Mangione, 26 years old, was sitting in a McDonald's restaurant in Altoona, Pennsylvania, roughly 230 miles west of New York City, when a customer who recognized him from the released surveillance photos alerted staff. Police arrived and took him into custody. When officers searched the gray backpack, they found a 9mm handgun, 3-dimensional printed, along with a silencer, also 3-dimensional printed, consistent with what had been used in the attack on Thompson. They found several $1,000s in cash, a United States passport, and a red notebook. It was the notebook that told the fuller story. Who was Luigi Mangione? That question consumed the country for weeks after his arrest, and the answer was not what most people expected. He was born in Towson, Maryland, into a family with significant wealth and standing in the Baltimore area, known for real estate holdings and private clubs. He attended an elite all-boys preparatory school, where he graduated as valedictorian of his class. He then enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the country's Ivy League institutions, where he earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree in computer science. After graduating, he worked remotely as a data engineer for a company called TrueCar, a position he left voluntarily in February of 2023, telling a former classmate that the work had been well-paying but mentally draining, and that he wanted time to read and pursue other interests. Friends described him as thoughtful, humble, and intellectually intense. He had no known criminal record. He was not the kind of person you build a profile around in advance. What investigators found in that red notebook and in diary entries written in the months before December 4th was a man who had been constructing a justification with the precision of someone who genuinely believed in what they were doing. In August of 2024, he wrote that he finally felt certain about his plan. He described the target not as a person, but as a symbol, writing that the health insurance industry operated like what he called a greed-fueled organization that was causing real harm to real people. He had suffered a serious back condition, spondylolisthesis, that had required medical treatment, and though prosecutors confirmed he was not a United Healthcare customer, investigators believe he chose the company specifically because it was the largest in the industry. The words etched onto the ammunition referenced a phrase long used by critics of insurance companies to describe how claims get denied or delayed. He had not stumbled into this. He had thought it through. Prosecutors in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office charged Mangione with first-degree murder, and a federal indictment followed with charges that initially included the possibility of the death penalty. That possibility was later removed when a federal judge ruled that the relevant statutes did not meet the legal definition of crimes of violence as required for capital punishment. As of early 2026, Mangione faces 9 counts in the New York State case, including second-degree murder, and 2 remaining federal counts carrying a maximum sentence of life in prison without parole.
He has pleaded not guilty to all charges. His state trial is anticipated to begin in the summer of 2026, with a federal trial to follow. He is currently held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York. His legal team, led by prominent defense attorneys, has argued aggressively on multiple procedural grounds. During a court appearance shortly after his arrest, Mangione yelled to reporters assembled outside that what was happening was an insult to the intelligence of the American people. He has been consistent in his posture. He does not appear to regard himself as someone who made a mistake. Brian Thompson was a father, a husband, and by all professional accounts, a competent executive doing a job within a system he did not design alone. His family lost him on a sidewalk before sunrise. That is not a debatable fact, and it does not soften with distance. What the Mangione case leaves behind, beyond the legal proceedings still working their way through the courts, is something harder to resolve. The knowledge that an enormous number of people looked at this case and felt something other than straightforward condemnation, not because they approved of the act, but because the grievance beneath it was one they recognized. And that, in its own quiet way, may be the most unsettling part of this story.
Randolph Sanders. Think about the person who sits next to you at work. They know your schedule. They know when you arrive in the morning, which bus stop you use, whether you wear headphones on your commute. They call you a colleague, maybe even a friend. They attend your wedding. They stand at your funeral. Now ask yourself, how well do you really know the people you trust with your daily life? Because in Philadelphia, on the morning of January 13, 2015, a 56-year-old woman named Kim Jones stepped out of her front door to catch the bus to work, and the person who ended her life was someone who had eaten at her table, grieved at her father's passing, and called her a mentor. This is the story of Randolph Sanders, a man who repaid 2 years of trust and opportunity with an act of cold calculation that stunned an entire city. Kim Jones was not a celebrity. She was not a public figure in any conventional sense. She was a program director at Turning Points for Children, a Philadelphia nonprofit organization that provided family support services and after-school outreach programs to some of the city's most vulnerable communities. She had spent decades dedicating her professional life to helping struggling families, the kind of work that rarely earns national headlines, but reshapes countless lives in quiet, lasting ways. She was a mother of 2. She had recently remarried just 30 days before her death, finally finding a new chapter of personal happiness after years on her own. By every account from colleagues, family members, and community partners, Kim Jones was exactly what her work suggested, a woman of genuine compassion and deep integrity. Randolph Sanders arrived at Turning Points for Children roughly 2 years before the events of January 2015. He had been hired as the assistant director of the Families and Schools Together program, known as FAST, a position that placed him directly under Jones's supervision. To the people around him, Sanders appeared engaged and competent. He was present, participatory, and seemingly committed to the mission of the organization. Jones reportedly trusted him. She mentored him. She included him in the inner workings of the program. And Sanders, it turned out, used every bit of that access to help himself to money that was never his. Over the course of his employment, investigators would later determine that Sanders had been processing fraudulent payment vouchers, checks meant to cover stipends for school volunteers, and redirecting the funds for his own use. The total amount stolen from the nonprofit, which received its funding from Pennsylvania's Department of Human Services, was estimated at approximately $42,000. For 2 years, the scheme held, and then Kim Jones began to notice discrepancies. She did not stay quiet. That was not who she was. Jones began her own accounting of the missing funds and concluded that Sanders was responsible. She told him directly. She confronted him about the mismanagement the day before her death, January 12, 2015. And she told him something else. She had scheduled a meeting with State Department of Human Services officials for the following morning to report the missing money. Sanders would face an investigation. He would lose his $68,000 a year job. He would lose the professional reputation he had spent years building. That meeting, scheduled for the morning of January 13th, was the deadline, and Sanders decided to make sure Kim Jones never arrived.
He packed a gun into a duffel bag. He knew her morning routine the way only a close colleague could: the street corner, the bus line, the time she left her house. Before 9 in the morning on January 13th, Sanders was already in position. Surveillance cameras captured him waiting near her home in the Yorktown neighborhood for over an hour before she emerged. He followed her toward the corner of 12th and Jefferson Streets in North Philadelphia, near Temple University, where she typically waited for the Route 23 SEPTA bus. Jones was leaning against a low brick wall, her work bag across her shoulder, her headphones in her ears. Gospel music was playing. She had no awareness of what was behind her. Sanders approached from above, climbing a small inclined lawn, and fired once. Jones was struck in the back of the head. She died at the scene. What followed was one of the most chilling performances in the case's aftermath. Sanders attended Kim Jones's funeral. He stood among grieving co-workers and family members. He shook the hand of her son, Andre Jordan. He gave a television interview to Philadelphia's WPVI-TV the day after she was taken from the world, describing himself as devastated. "We're all just stunned," he told the camera. "I believe Tuesday she was celebrating her 30 days of being married." He said it with a straight face, looking directly into the lens, while the woman he had laid in wait for was being prepared for burial. Police were already working around the clock. Detectives spent weeks reviewing hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, piecing together the gunman's path from the bus stop, through the Temple University campus, onto the subway system, and out to a GMC Yukon parked several miles away. The vehicle matched the description of a car Sanders drove. On January 31st, 2015, the Yukon was spotted outside Sanders' home in northeast Philadelphia. The following day, detectives brought him in for questioning. He confessed. On video, in writing, without coercion, he admitted that he had gone after Jones because of what she was about to expose. He called it a, quote, work-related matter that just got out of hand. For investigators who had spent weeks poring over footage of a woman being shot while listening to gospel music, those words landed with particular weight. On March 6, 2017, after 2 hours of deliberation, a jury of 7 men and 5 women found Randolph Sanders guilty of first-degree murder. The judge in the case, who had spent 35 years in law and on the bench, told the courtroom that the evidence against Sanders had been among the most conclusive he had ever encountered. Sanders was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated in Pennsylvania today. Kim Jones was 56 years old. She had just celebrated 1 month of marriage. She was on her way to a meeting to protect public funds meant to serve struggling families. She was wearing headphones. She never saw it coming. Her son's words after the arrest say everything: that his mother was a respected, generous, selfless woman who had done nothing but try to help people, and the man she trusted most in her professional life made sure she never got to the end of that street corner.
Mario Betancourt. There is a particular kind of audacity that turns a workplace grievance into a calculated act of destruction. The audacity of a man who decides, in the space between being handed his termination and walking out the door, that the people who let him go will not live to see the next morning. Most people, when they lose a job, feel the sting of it. They drive home, they process it, they move on. Mario Betancourt did not move on. He made a decision instead, and that decision put 2 men in the ground, sent him running across 3 states and across an international border, and launched one of the most tenacious extradition battles in Florida criminal history. The padding store was not a glamorous business. Located in Port St. Lucie, Florida, it was a modest commercial operation owned and run by 49-year-old Richard Mashler. The business specialized in manufacturing pads for exercise equipment, the kind of enterprise that runs on early mornings, physical work, and a small team of people who know each other well. Richard Mashler employed a handful of workers, among them 47-year-old Mario Betancourt and 39-year-old Kenneth Conklin. On the surface, it was an unremarkable small business doing unremarkable work in a quiet Florida city. But the relationships inside that building would end in a way that no one who walked through those doors each morning could have anticipated. In January of 2000, something shifted. Betancourt was let go, fired from his position at the padding store.
The exact details of why he was terminated have not been fully disclosed in public records, but what investigators would later piece together was that the moment of his dismissal became the moment everything else began. Betancourt was described by law enforcement as a disgruntled employee, a man whose criminal history already stretched back more than 2 decades before that January morning. This was not a man encountering the law for the first time. This was a man with a record, with a pattern, and now with what he perceived as a motive. He came back to the padding store with a 9mm pistol. When it was over, Richard Mashler had been struck twice. Kenneth Conklin, his co-worker, had been struck 5 times. Both men died. What was a functioning small business, a place where men had gone to earn a living and build something, became a crime scene in Port St. Lucie. The community reacted with the particular shock that workplace tragedies always produce, because the randomness of it forces everyone to ask the same question. Could this have happened anywhere? Could anyone who hires someone, anyone who works alongside someone, find themselves in the middle of something like this? Think about what it meant for the families of Richard Mashler and Kenneth Conklin. Mashler had built the padding store from the ground up, employing people, running payroll, keeping a business alive. Conklin was a co-worker who happened to be present when a man with a gun returned to a place he had been asked to leave. Neither of them had any warning. Neither of them had the chance to understand what was happening before it was already too late. 2 families, 2 sets of children, 2 circles of people who would spend years without answers and without justice. Because Mario Betancourt ran.
After the shootings, he moved quickly toward Miami-Dade County, putting distance between himself and Port St. Lucie. Then he disappeared entirely. Law enforcement across Florida searched for him. The case was eventually featured on America's Most Wanted, John Walsh's nationally broadcast program that had become one of the most effective tools in the country for tracking fugitives who had slipped the reach of local police. Betancourt's face was shown to millions of viewers. Tip lines were opened. And still, for months, nothing came back that led to an arrest. 15 months after the shootings at the padding store, authorities got their break. Mario Betancourt was located in Cancun, Mexico. Mexican law enforcement took him into custody in April of 2001, and the news reached Port St. Lucie with a mixture of relief and frustration, because the arrest was only the beginning of a new battle. Getting Betancourt back on American soil proved to be an undertaking that would consume years of effort by Port St. Lucie detectives, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials at multiple levels of state and federal government. The obstacle was the death penalty. Mexico had long maintained a firm policy of refusing extradition in cases where the suspect could face execution upon return. Florida, of course, maintained first-degree murder charges carrying that very possibility. Prosecutors and police in St. Lucie County spent years in negotiations with Mexican authorities, working through diplomatic channels, arguing their case, trying to find an arrangement that satisfied both governments. Officer Casey Donnell, the police spokesman on the case, would later describe the process with characteristic understatement. They had been fighting for years, and it had been an uphill battle every step of the way. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The death penalty was removed from the table as a condition of extradition. What remained were 2 counts of first-degree murder. In the spring of 2004, 3 years after his capture in Cancun, and more than 4 years after the killings themselves, Mario Betancourt was returned to the United States and transported to the St. Lucie County Jail. Detective John Holman, who had worked the case from its earliest hours, made the trip to Miami-Dade County personally to take custody of him and bring him back. The case proceeded through St. Lucie County's court system under case number 562-000-CF-000-102A. Betancourt was convicted. His appeals continued for years. In December of 2021, Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal affirmed the denial of his motion challenging his conviction. He was, at that point, still incarcerated and still fighting from inside the system he had spent years trying to escape. Richard Mashler was 49 years old. He had built something. Kenneth Conklin was 39 years old. He had simply gone to work. Mario Betancourt decided on a January morning in 2000 that neither of those men's lives was worth more than his anger at losing a job.
It took 4 years to bring him to account for that decision. It took another 17 years of appeals before the courts finally, fully said no. What happened at the padding store had an answer, and the answer was not going to change.
Domenic Micheli. Monday morning, June 4th, 2018, 7 a.m. in Belle Meade, one of Nashville's most affluent communities. Inside a strip mall shopping center, personal training clients are already sweating through their early morning workout, music playing, a normal Tuesday beginning to take shape, when a man walks through the door of Balance Training carrying a hatchet in each hand. He had been fired from that same gym 14 months earlier. He had been planning his return ever since. What does a year of quiet resentment look like from the outside? In Domenic Micheli's case, it looked almost invisible, until it didn't. Joel Pavola was 46 years old and the kind of man people described using the same words: enthusiastic, dedicated, warm. He had built Balance Training into a reputable personal fitness center in Nashville's Belle Meade community, and his clients were devoted to him. Nashville restaurateur Randy Rayburn, who had trained with Pavola for years, would later say he was one of the most well-rounded and wonderful human beings he had ever known. He was also a husband and the father of 5 children. On that Monday morning in June 2018, he was doing exactly what he did every day, assisting clients through their workout, showing up the way he always did. He had no way of knowing that a man he had let go over a year earlier had been quietly coming undone, and that the unraveling had finally arrived at his door. Domenic Micheli had worked at Balance Training as a personal trainer. Pavola had dismissed him sometime in 2017, roughly 14 months before the morning everything changed. The termination, by all accounts, was not the end of the story for Micheli. It was the beginning of something far darker. In the months that followed, people close to him noticed a shift. He began posting increasingly erratic and paranoid content on social media, writing in a fractured, ominous voice about justice, mercy, and forces working against him. In one post from April of 2018, just weeks before the attack, he mentioned having a hatchet in his car. In another, he wrote that there would be no mercy after a certain point. The posts were a window into a mind pulling further and further from reality. In late April of 2018, Micheli drove his silver Toyota to Washington, D.C., pulled up to a security checkpoint near the White House, and refused to move. He was arrested on a misdemeanor trespassing charge. A court-appointed clinical psychologist evaluated him and found him competent to stand trial. He was placed in a pre-trial halfway house under supervision, with a court date scheduled for mid-June. None of that stopped what was already in motion. On June 1st, 3 days before the attack, he wrote his final public post. Investigators later noted that the progression of his online writing leading up to that week carried the unmistakable pattern of someone who had made a decision. In the morning of June 4th, surveillance cameras captured Micheli pacing through the parking garage beneath the Belle Meade Galleria shopping center before the attack. He entered Balance Training shortly before 7 a.m. Witnesses inside the gym saw him come through the door carrying a hatchet and a large knife. Pavola tried to defend himself. There was a struggle, and by the accounts of those present, it was not brief. Pavola died in the ambulance on the way to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, never making it inside. His clients, who had been there to work on their health, were left to process what they had just witnessed. Micheli fled the scene in his Toyota. Less than 2 hours later, he limped into an urgent care facility in Gallatin, roughly 35 miles away, seeking treatment for a leg wound he had sustained during the confrontation. When he was told the facility did not carry suture kits, he left within 5 minutes. An hour after that, surveillance cameras at a nearby drugstore caught him purchasing medical supplies himself. He was injured, on the run, and recognizable, and the country was looking for him. The manhunt lasted just over 36 hours. On the evening of June 5th, a motorist driving along Interstate 65 near Bowling Green, Kentucky, recognized Micheli's face and his Toyota from news coverage and called in a tip. Kentucky State Police stopped the vehicle and took him into custody without incident. Micheli was described as fully cooperative. When Metro Nashville detectives interviewed him, he admitted to the killing in detail. A hatchet, a large knife, and blood were found inside the car. The legal proceedings that followed stretched over several years, complicated by ongoing mental health evaluations. Multiple expert witnesses testified that McKaylee had schizophrenia, a diagnosis that shaped how his defense approached the case. In November 2022, a Davidson County judge sentenced Dominic McKaylee to 25 years in prison after he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The judge acknowledged the mental health findings, but held firm on the sentence, citing the nature of Joel Paola's death. Joel Paola left behind a wife and 5 children. His clients remembered him as someone who made mornings better, who showed up every day with energy and purpose. He was taken from his family inside the business he built by someone he had once employed and then let go. That is the part that stays with you. Not a stranger, not a random act. Someone who had stood in that same space, been given an opportunity, and then spent over a year deciding what to do about losing it. Some people grieve a job loss and start over. Others disappear into their own minds, nursing something that grows in the silence. With Dominic McKaylee, the warning signs were there, written in his own words, posted publicly, months in advance. The question that lingers is the one without a comfortable answer. At what point does someone stop being a person in pain and start being a threat? And who is responsible for knowing the difference?